Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I can't tell you, so excited to be here with Eliot Stein, who wrote this book called The Custodians of Wonder, which as soon as I saw it, I was like, I have got to talk to this guy because I don't know where he got these ideas. I don't know where he met these people, but it is the best book. And I have not completely read it, but I do know that it's impactful. It's going to have an impact on this world. So we're going to be talking about that in a second. But before we get to Eliot, I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. And I'd like to thank Eliot for letting us share this program with other libraries because, when libraries work together, kind of make magic. And you can buy signed books by Eliot from our favorite indie bookstore, Aesop's Fable. You're going to have to do it quick, though, because Eliot just told me that the book is sold out pretty much everywhere. So I do know that Aesop's has a stack of them. And if you have questions during our talk, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. Sometimes the chat goes by too quickly for me to pick up questions. So please put them in the Q&A. We're just having a conversation. We might show some pictures, but generally we're just going to be talking about Eliot and his book and how amazing it is. That'll be me. He'll be just like talking about normal stuff. So Eliot, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for such a lovely, generous introduction. Nice to be here.
Thank you. That was like off the top of my head, believe it or not. Okay, so Eliot, first, I'm going to say that you wrote this book, Custodians of Wonder. The full title is Custodians of Wonder, Ancient Customs, Profound Traditions, and the Last People Keeping Them Alive. So even with that title, um, it's so intriguing. But from your bio, you says you're happiest in a kayak, a treehouse, or a bike lane, which is interesting because you have traveled the world looking for people about, their customs. And, that just seems to fit in perfectly. You're also the deputy editor of BBC Travel, so that also makes sense. So tell us more about yourself because I'm sure everybody wants to hear from you and not from me.
Sure. I'm a writer and editor. I'm based in New York. I work at BBC, specifically BBC Travel, which is actually based here in New York, in this very office. And I've spent most of the past 7 years traveling around the globe, doing something that my very patient wife and 3-year-old have graciously allowed me to do, which is to profile people who are preserving an age-old wonder and tradition that would otherwise be lost. And specifically, these customs and traditions are things that historically have shaped a community in a profound way. Um, so it's not just the last person doing something, but what these things represent and kind of examining and pondering why human beings do these beautiful, gentle, irrational things that make us who we are.
Mhm. And can you tell us a little bit about your process of coming up with this book? Like I said, I want to know about the idea. Where did you get the idea from? And then how did you go about making it happen?
It's a great question. So I was living in Berlin, and I was a freelance journalist. I was writing for places like the New York Times, for BBC, for CNN, National Geographic. And for BBC specifically, I started reporting on final custodians. And the reason is because about 20 years ago, when I was pretty much just out of college, a chance encounter with one such person in an island off of the Venetian lagoon in Italy sort of awakened me to these final custodians and their stories and how these gentle rites that humans do have shaped a place and a community. So that sort of stayed with me and still guides me 20 years later. So I started pitching these stories to the BBC. They did really well. They resonated with a lot of people. And I created a column called Custom Made, which was all about human beings doing remarkable things against all odds. That led to this book. So the book is 10 stories, one tradition, one custom per chapter, 10 countries, 5 continents. And four of them are expanded from previous stories that I've written, and six of them are totally new. But that's how this came about. And it's admittedly a different and perhaps strange way of viewing the world. But I found that meeting these these final custodians are it's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and um, it's a very interesting way to make sense of the world.
Hmm. Were any of those stories, it says that one of the stories in your column recently won the grand prize at the 87th annual Writer's Digest competition. Were any of those stories one of these that ended up in the book?
So that story actually didn't make it in this book. That story was about the last woman alive who makes miso. Miso is mentioned in the Rosetta Stone, in the Bible many times, but essentially it's a woman who lives off an island of Italy, specifically Sardinia, where I lived for several years, and she dives at night, protected by the Italian Coast Guard, using the moonlight to guide her. She dives down about 27 meters and collects this incredibly rare um, filament from a mollusk called Besus.
Mm,
And she then, once she comes back to the surface and back to her studio, she dries it, she spins it, and she dyes it so that it glimmers like gold. And
mm,
she creates these incredibly elaborate um, weavings of it. But it's essentially mollusk spit. And she's the only woman alive who knows how to do this. And the story is all about trying to find a successor after this thing has been passed down for 20 some generations in her family, and what it means to this island off the coast of Sardinia, which is famous for it when she fades away. Um, so I actually reached out to her once this book was acquired by St. Martin's to see if she would be willing for me to come back to the island and profile her. Um, but I was the first and only person that she wanted to talk to, and she essentially retired from talking to the media afterward. So for that, I respected that and did not include her in this book.
hmm. Wow. So whether that really begs the question for me about how did you find your stories? Did people come to you and say, "Oh, this is the last person making this particular kind of pasta in Italy. This is the last person who is the mailman in this very remote area," kind of thing? Because those are some of the stories in the book. So how did you find the stories, and then how did you cull them down to the ones that you put in the book?
It's a great question. So there's no real one way that I find these stories. I used to live in Sardinia, and it's a wonderful bastion of age-old antique customs. And one such story is in the book. It's about the rarest pasta in the world.
Mhm.
Only three women alive who know how to make this pasta because it's so astonishingly complex that they've tightly guarded the secret, but also other people that they try to teach the pasta to, such as celebrity chefs like Jamie Oliver, they throw up their hands and they're completely exasperated by the process. Um, so some of the stories are based on places where I've lived. I've lived in Germany, I've lived in Italy, and so forth. Other times it's kind of a chance encounter, or sometimes it's a lot of painstaking research. And one story in the book that anyone watching from the general Massachusetts area might be interested in is actually set in Medford, Massachusetts. And so this is the first chapter in the book. It's called The Living Libraries of West Africa. West Africa is obviously very far away from Medford, Massachusetts. But the story is essentially about the Mali Empire. And the Mali Empire was the greatest civilization to ever come out of West Africa. But most Americans have no idea about anything regarding the Mali Empire. It's not something I ever learned about in school. It's not something that you watch and see documentaries on TV. But when the empire was founded, the person who put the empire together, the first king, bestowed to one musician this sacred instrument called a balafon, which is essentially the originator of the marimba, the xylophone. You strike it with wooden mallets, it makes this enchanting sound. And this person's job wasn't just to play the balafon, but as he played it, to recite the history of the empire and to essentially act as an encyclopedia for this empire.
Mhm.
In an astonishing tradition that has been passed down for 27 generations, every male member of this one family has learned how to master the balafon and also to recite and memorize the entire many century history of this empire. The heir to this tradition doesn't live in West Africa, but lives in Bedford, Massachusetts. Um, and this tradition, which is known as the soso bala, that's the instrument, the single instrument that started the empire, still exists. and it is kept in a 150-person village in rural Guinea that has no electricity or water, and this family still guards it. The only person who's allowed to play it is the head of the family, and whenever it leaves the village, he has to carry it on his head. So after about a week of, and I'm getting to your question here, after a week of, or a month or so of connecting the dots between a 12th century West African emperor and this address in Medford, Massachusetts, I sent a hopeful email to a person I'd never met before, saying who I was, saying how much I admired and respected this tradition, and hoping that he would be willing to tell me about his family's history and perhaps to take me back to the place where it started. So within 30 minutes of sending that email, I received a call on my phone from a number that was unrecognized, and I picked it up. And the first thing this person said to me before even introducing himself was, "I've been waiting for an email like that for 20 years." So we soon got our visas and took a trip to Mali, to Bamako, where his family lives, and then drove over the border to Guinea, where his extended family still lives. And I became the first foreign journalist in history to see this instrument. And the astonishing thing about this, if anyone who's watching knows anything about UNESCO, UNESCO has 678 items that are on its intangible heritage of humanity. So these are basically the best flourishes of human expression of culture. It's Chinese calligraphy, it's Indian yoga, it's Argentinian tango. But the only single thing of this 678 list that has remained within a single family is this. And so it was such a joy and an honor for me to meet this person whose name is Bala Kuyate from Medford, Massachusetts, and then to travel with him to to recount this story that I think a lot of people don't know and to hopefully introduce something beautiful to readers who might not otherwise know about it.
Hmm. And what is why do you think these stories have not been told before? I mean, is it just because it's just part of life and we don't really think of like, a musical instrument as something like that is so, like I said, impactful around the things that we're so busy with.
Yeah, these are quiet, gentle human rights that don't make big splashes, right? They're also so historical that these aren't the sorts of things you're going to read about in a headline in a newspaper, in a magazine. And that's what draws me to them. I talk about this in the introduction, but so often we hear about the first person to do something, the pioneers, the ones who move us forward, but rarely is there a whisper for the last person to carry on a right. And what I was hoping to do with this book was to honor these individuals before they pass. Um, so Bala's story is one such example. I mean, some of the other examples in the book,
Oh, wait, I have to interrupt you. Is Bala going to continue the tradition?
it's a great question. So Bala lives in Medford because Bala was hoping to introduce the Balaphone to an entirely different audience. He currently teaches at the New England Conservatory. He has, I mean, Bala arrived just before this tradition was proclaimed by UNESCO in 2001. He was an undocumented immigrant working at a convenience store in Albany, New York, um, quietly tapping his balophone at night while he was living in an apartment with four other people. Today, he is part of Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble. He teaches at this university. He has performed at Harvard, at MIT. Um, he tours all over the country. He's an incredibly accomplished human being and musician, but he also has two American kids. And so his story, which is one of the common through lines in this book, is what happens to this tradition if he chooses to no longer maintain it or can't find a successor. Um, so I won't spoil the answer to this, but we get to that at the end of the chapter.
Okay. And did it have to be a boy that carried on the tradition?
It's a great question. So bala is what's known as a jelly. And a jelly in Mandinka culture means blood, because typically, just as a person can't live without blood, a community can't live without a jelly. Most jellies are male, but some jellies are female. They perform different instruments and have different roles, but this specific one has to be a male. And he
Interesting.
does have a son.
So it could be carried on. Although some of these things go away because of technology, right? Things change and we don't appreciate the handmade anymore.
Yeah, you know, it's technology, it's ease of travel, it's economics. The heir to the world's rarest pasta, Paola Abraini, she told me verbatim, there's no history in this. Excuse me, there's no future in this. You can't make a living making su filendeo, which is the name of the pasta. And she had a really haunting quote that stayed with me. She said, "So many things that once were no longer are, and that's not up to me anymore." Um, and so I think that's one of the main through lines in this book is whether it's because economics or other factors, what happens when we price out cultural heritage and is that bad?
Hmm. Did you come to a conclusion about that?
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, culture it's an ever evolving force, right? You know, not everything that is new is bad, not everything that is old is good. I think that for me, it's less about the tradition itself and more about the way of life it represents.
Mhm.
In culture is essentially a community's unique worldview. It's how they interact with the world. It's how they see it. And I think when one of these wonders fades away, part of our humanity vanishes with it. We are less rich when these things go away. Um, and in an ever-connected world, as we continue to become more and more homogenized, there's something sad about that when we speak the same languages, eat the same foods, carry the same coffee from Starbucks, regardless of where we are in the world. There's something a little bit sad about that, especially if you're someone who travels to be stirred by the unfamiliar and wowed by how little you know. Um, there is something quite tragic about that to me.
Mhm. Yeah. And did you get a sense of why people have kept on these traditions? I mean, there's obviously the family tradition, like the people were doing, but like for instance, this pasta that you're talking about, um, is it because they knew they're the only person still doing it that they kept doing it?
No, it's because and one of the things that I really try to target is traditions that unite entire communities. So this pasta, it's called the Threads of God, su filindeo in Sardinian. And the Threads of God, it's typically the only way that you are able to eat the Threads of God is to hike 33 kilometers overnight from a tiny little town in the center of Sardinia called Nuoro to a pilgrimage village called Lula. And you do it overnight in pitch blackness. So when you arrive at this pilgrim village, you are blessed with the threads of God, essentially the same way that you might be in communion or something like that. And so this is something that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and it speaks to the very identity of Sardinia. Sardinia in the center specifically, it was the only place in modern day Italy that was never conquered by the Romans. Most listeners might hear the word Sardinia and they think turquoise beaches and luxury holidays. But that's not really what Sardinia is about. Sardinia's history, its entire being, is millennia of pushing back people who have come to invade it. It sits in the very center of the Western world, but kind of far away enough that it remembers things other places have forgotten. And one of the things that it is typically done is just rejected outside forces. And so this festival, this dish, is very much a celebration of that exact thing. So for me, and I think for these communities, it's not just so much about eating the threads of God, but it's about these threads that unite an entire island and where people come from hundreds of kilometers away just to do this pilgrimage, just to receive this offering. And
Mhm.
I think that's what's really profound and makes this story, but also the 10 in the book so rich.
Mhm. I love how you have this sort of lens on this where you can look at it from the piece of pasta to the global implications of that community. That's really astounding because like I don't think a lot of people can do that without somebody, really explaining it to them. I appreciate that. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about the story about the last Inca bridge?
Yes. So very similar to Mali. People watching this might know a thing or two about the Inca Empire. You've probably heard of Machu Picchu. But the Inca were an incredible, incredible civilization and one of the most unique civilizations in history. They're one of the few civilizations that developed north to south instead of east to west.
Hmm.
And at their height, around 1490 to 1550 or so, they stretched 200 square kilometers from the southern tip of Colombia down to Argentina. And the way they were able to, it's the biggest empire in the history of the Americas, but the way they were able to forge this empire is through an extraordinary road system. And unlike the Roman road system that went over a relatively uniform topography, the Incas went from the snow-capped peaks of the Andes Mountains, which is the tallest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere, down to the steamy depths of the Amazon. So they bore tunnels, they paved stones, but where they couldn't connect from one ravine to another, they wove suspension bridges out of grass. And it's incredible. They would take this straw called koya ichu, braid it, and create suspension bridges that were strong enough to support the weight of a marching army. At the height of the empire, there were 200 of these things that stretched across ravines. Today, there's only one. And the world's last Inca bridge is maintained by the world's last Inca bridge master, a person who is named Victoriano Arizapana, and he's been doing this as his forefathers have been doing it for more than 500 years. Um, and so similar, the story is about, and I went to watch him reweave this bridge because you have to do it every year. It's about the bridge, but it's also about why these four communities living at the top of the world in the Andes come together every year, 500 years after this empire collapsed. And what is it that compels them to do this thing? Especially because about a 5 minute walk away, there's now a modern steel bridge.
Hmm.
So Victoriano leads this thing every year where 1,100 people come together. Each household is responsible for a certain amount of braided straw, and he leads it like a captain, where at the culmination of it, he throws himself off this ravine, 7 stories high, balancing precariously over these four cables, barefoot, and he takes all of the straw and weaves this bridge. And lots of people have died doing this, including people in his family. But it's a sacrifice that he makes because it represents a certain worldview that the Inca had. Um, and it was probably one of the most astonishing things I've ever seen. I I do have pictures of it, but we can I can share those after if you'd like.
Sure. Um, I have to ask you about perception because these kind of skills, some people would consider to be primitive. Here is a steel bridge right next door. It's like, very high tech, whatever. And then there's this primitive, and I put that in quotes on purpose, bridge made of grass. And, but to me, that sounds like an amazing engineering marvel that they've been doing for 500 years, so that they not only figured out how to make it strong enough, and then how to get it across a ravine to stay there for a year. So when you talk about these stories, do people have that understanding of, it seems like it's like this like old fashioned type of thing to do, but actually it shows their ingenuity.
I get into this in the chapters. I think, I mean, it is amazingly complex. So when the Spanish arrived, the Spanish famously had a pretty big encounter with the Inca. They had never seen anything like this. There were no suspension bridges, anything like this in Europe. They were so terrified of these bridges that there are tons of chroniclers accounting that they used to weep as they'd crawl across these bridges. There's an MIT professor named John Oschendorfer who calculated that each of these bridges could hold something like 100 men and their horses. There's also the fact that these are completely biodegradable, so that you cut them if an approaching army is coming through, and they just fall into this rushing river that's below it. Um, and there's no pollution here. Um, it's it's rather remarkable. There's another story in India about a metal mirror, and we can get to this now, or we can get to this later on. But the technology that they use that they created to develop this is astonishing. The story is called "The Mirror That Reveals Your Truest Self," and essentially, for about 400 years, there's this one family, one extended family in the southern tip of India, in the region of Kerala, that has been guarding this secret formula for a metal that is supposed to reveal your truest self. And I didn't know anything about this before researching the story, but essentially, when you look at a modern mirror, chances are you're looking at a glass mirror. And if you're watching this, you can try this at home. But when you go and you tap the surface, there's a small bit of space between where your finger hits the glass and the glass itself. That's because the way that a modern mirror works in a standard plane mirror, light travels through the glass, it hits a reflective surface in the back, and it comes back. And in light passing through the glass, there's a small distortion. And what that means is that the image that you're seeing of yourself is not exactly how other people see you. Instead, in a metal mirror, the light hits exactly that surface and bounces right back. And we use metal mirrors for everything like um, NASA satellites, for surgery. Whenever we need a very, very precise reflection, we use a metal mirror. But it's one thing to develop a metal mirror in a lab. It's another thing to develop it on the bank of a river in a mangrove forest under thatched roofs. And so for hundreds of years, these people have been doing this. And I talked to scientists in this book who tell me that it is one of the hardest things. It's called the delta phase, a perfect reflection. It's one of the hardest technological things to do, and the fact that this one family has been able to unlock that is astonishing. So to get back to your great question, I think we view these old things perhaps as outdated, as primitive, um, but there's so much wisdom in these things. Even to get back to the Molly story, you talk to archaeologists, and they make a habit of interviewing these jellies, these encyclopedias of oral storytelling. And what they say time and time again is that once you hear these things from these people, and then you take what they're saying and say, okay, we need to dig here, 9 times out of 10, they find something extraordinary. So I would certainly challenge that these things that are old are primitive, and that things that are new and scientific are necessarily better.
Yeah. No, I agree because I think that we've always had that sort of perception of newer is better, but that's not necessarily true. And in fact, when I first read the title of your book, I actually thought it was about lost indigenous tribes that you were going to, you had found these tribes and they were showing you things that they had been, how they lived off the land. And so many people, you talked about the Incas and how they were taken over, not taken over, but like, there's a they had a bad relationship with this was it the Spaniards. I don't remember, but that people were constantly like, oh, they're so primitive. We want them to change. We want them to be modern. Um, and that is you lose so much in that when you force that kind of change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't. What is it called? It doesn't honor like the history and the culture at all if you just change it to something that is, you know, more efficient or something.
No, we need these things, these irrational things. People, if you think about how many trial and errors it must have taken to get 1,000 people to braid grass,
Hmm.
uh, these are the things that to me make the world so wondrously diverse. The fact that human beings are doing these things. Um, you put a steel bridge in there and it's a steel bridge, and the world to me becomes a little bit less interesting.
Hmm.
Uh,
Right, because you could go to any country and find a steel bridge, but you can't go anywhere and find an Incan woven grass, you know, bridge structure. Um, it's that originality, the uniqueness that is being lost, I think. Wendy asks if you, this is so funny, will be on book tour because she'd love to see you in person. I think you've been on book tour though, right?
I've done some stuff, and we'll be doing a few things here in New York. I'm doing something in San Francisco at the end of the month. But Wendy, I'll welcome any thoughts you have. Certainly love love to talk about these traditions, but more so the incredible people who've been maintaining them. And
Mhm.
I was talking to Mina before the talk started, but I mean, this is sort of a labor of love for me. I took a 9 month sabbatical from the BBC where I work. It is, it's certainly expensive to travel around the world to do these things, but the most important thing for me is that I tell these stories with dignity and honor from the people who have dedicated their lives and so many generations before them to maintaining them. And what's been most thrilling to me, in addition to being able to talk to very nice, interesting people like yourself, is just to hear pretty pretty uniformly that I mean, very uniformly that I've done these stories justice, and that's nice. That's always nice to hear.
Mhm. Donnie wants to know how and where did you do all of your historical research for all of the places and people and their backgrounds?
Great question. Um, I mean, I think the most important thing for me, in addition to getting these stories right, is to get it to basically dissolve into the background. This book is not about me in any way at all, but basically to use this book as a platform for people from that community to tell their own stories. I think that's incredibly important. I think that's what travel journalism should be, what we're moving toward, hopefully. So time and again, when researching these stories, my sources were those communities, historians, experts, scientists from those communities, from those countries and cultures. Um, we talk about the Mali and the Inca, great examples. These are two incredible societies that didn't have a written language. And so for so long, their histories and what little we know about them has been told from other groups. In the case of the Mali, you have North African traders, you have French colonists afterward. So it is important. In the Inca, you have the Spanish. So it is very important for me to use these stories as a way for these communities to tell their own stories. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. But did you have to, because I'm a librarian, did you like visit libraries? Did you get digital resources as you were, once you've gotten the story right, because you have such a wealth of knowledge of like what was going on in the civilizations, what kind of research or where did you do your research? Some of it during COVID? Did you have to like call people or get, PDFs or something from libraries or historical societies or anything like that?
Great question. There's a very robust bibliography and endnotes in the book. So yes, I mean that's any researcher, any writer will tell you that you have to all of this has to stand very, very strongly on reporting. So yeah, I wrote half the book in the New York Public Library. I went through thousands of documents. I interviewed. I'm forever grateful to the hundreds of people that I interviewed for this book. Um, but yeah, it's a pretty robust book report in the back of that book.
That's it's good to know because some of these stories seem to be to me obscure, finding out about Bala in this 150 person village. How did you actually get any real information about it? So I'm glad to hear that there's actually like primary resources about those cultures. Joy says, I'm from Medford and would love to have you visit here and do something with Bala and the Bala phone. So you can find Elliot on his website. I'll send that out in a recap email. And AS says that they have your book on hold from the public library. Yay, libraries. And can't wait to read it. Will there be a part two?
Ooh, good question. I mean, the hardest thing about this book was narrowing down the stories to 10. So, I guess the immediate answer to your question, hopefully, I have a lot of these stories I'd love to tell. But in sort of, and this maybe gets to an early question of yours, Mina, is just how do you come up with these stories? I or at least the 10 to include, you don't want them all to be in South America or in Asia. So you cast a wide geographical net. It was also important to me to cast a wide thematic net. So these aren't only about culinary traditions or oral history traditions or musicology, but they sort of reflect the wealth of humanity and what we do as a species. So it's some of them are artistic, some of them are oral, some of them are music, some of them are food. So I wanted to cast as wide a net as possible to just sort of represent these these things that we do that make us who we are, and to perhaps also suggest that this isn't just happening in one place, but this homogenization and local extinction, as one person called it, is happening everywhere.
Mhm. I can only imagine. But when you were talking about the mirror, it made me think of Harry Potter and the Mirror of Erised. Have you read that? Where if you look into the mirror, it tells you your greatest desire, and your true self, as you say. I think that I mean it's just interesting that like in that storytelling of Harry Potter, it could have pulled from that um, metaphysical element of having a metal mirror to tell you who you are and what's important to you.
Yeah, and that's kind of what the chapter is about. So it's this mirror, and it's this extraordinary mirror that reveals a 99.999% perfect reflection, but more so it's about this community along the Malabar coast, which is the southwestern part of India, and how in Hinduism, mirrors are used as not just to gauge your physical appearance, but they're forms of introspection. And
Mm.
specifically in this part of India, they're historically gauged to examine your soul. And so this mirror itself is one of the nine most sacred instruments in a local Hindu rituals. So it's what this mirror really represents to people, as opposed to the physical mirror itself. And I think that's what gives the story so much depth.
Mhm. Which is interesting because I think the more we move forward in society, the less we want to see ourselves. Like I have filters all over this Zoom call. Like I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna put makeup on, but I'm gonna have filters on, kind of thing. So I look like I have makeup on. So like there's this constant like push pull of like what we actually want and what we don't want to see in ourselves. Um, so I think it's very telling that in that culture that's so important to see your real self. I'm going to get to a few more questions. Lawrence asked, and I have the same question. Did you come across people who claim to know secret skills or have secret knowledge who were lying?
Um, well, so I had a newborn when this project came about, um, and I have a very patient wife. So it's all a way of saying I tried to really do my homework before traveling across the world to meet these custodians. So no, I didn't have that problem, fortunately. But yeah, you want to do your homework before you get in a big gas guzzling jet plane and travel around the world to verify these things.
Mhm.
Yeah, but it's a great question.
Diana asked, did you look in the mirror and what did you see and feel?
Another good question. So this is part of the chapter, but I did come to acquire one of these mirrors. And I won't give away the ending, but yes, I have one. I look at it very sparingly. There's a certain power and energy of force with that mirror that you don't just tack it to your wall and kind of leave it up. But yeah, I did, and it was only sort of through a random chance thing that happened after I returned from reporting the story that I felt compelled to look in the mirror.
I think I would for sure. No filters. Steven says, would love to see these amazing people in their craft on film or video. Any chance of that? Which makes me think this is a good time to show some of your pictures and maybe talk a little bit about them. But I don't know if you want to talk about if this book has been optioned or anything like that.
I think a lot of people have had similar thoughts. So, fingers crossed, we'll see. It's only been out a month and a half, so I don't know how quickly or slowly these things work, but yeah, I'm happy to show some pictures if you'd like.
Absolutely.
What's the best way to do this, Mina? Should I
Um,
share my screen?
mhm.
Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
This is the Keswachaka.
Uh,
So this is the rope bridge.
can you make it full screen by any chance?
Sorry, can I make it what?
Can you make that full screen?
We'll see.
If not, it's fine. Oop,
Uh, I don't think I can actually.
that's all right. Let's go back to it then.
Okay. So this is the Quetzalcoatl. It's 30 meters wide. It's 7 stories high. And what you can't see here is that there is a gushing, foaming river right below it. But if you look very closely in the back, I don't know if you can see this, that is the modern steel bridge. And so there's no practical reason that these communities need to come together every year to reweave this thing and to risk their lives. But as part of the original, it's called the Kapaknyan, which means the Royal Road. People from these communities, the descendants of the Inca, feel a certain power when they walk on the road. And this was part of the original road. So they come together to weave this thing from the empire. But what's equally important about it is that they do it in the exact same way that they've always done it. And so
Mhm.
I get into this in the book, but the Inca were essentially the world's first socialist society. There was no money, there was no wheel, there was no property, but nobody went hungry. The Inca, they gave food to everyone. Everyone had a certain role. And one of the ways that they created this extraordinary road system was that everyone volunteered to do things once a year. And that exact same system of reciprocity exists today. And that's how they come together to weave this bridge.
Kathy wants to know, did you walk across the bridge?
Yeah, I did. I kind of agree with the Spanish. It's absolutely terrifying. It sort of feels like it sways back and forth like a hammock in the wind, but also when there's someone walking with you, for anyone who's ever been in a waterbed, their movement bounces back, and so it's this kind of it sort of feels like you're tightrope walking across a waterbed. I found it terribly terrifying,
It does
but
look like there's two people on the bridge, though.
yeah, those were children as well.
Oh, no
So,
fear. No fear.
but llamas go across it, alpacas.
Oh, wow. Oh, did you want to? Oh, yeah, I was going to say if you wanted to show a full screen, there was a way to do it. Um, do you want to go back to your pictures?
Sure. Are you still seeing the screen at all?
No,
Okay.
we lost the share.
Oh, one moment. So
So see
this,
where it says share up on the right-hand side? Right below it, it has those four little um oop, out. You can actually make it full screen from there. Right under where it says share, and there's a little arrow on the right-hand side of your screen. Keep going to the right. Keep going to
uh,
the right. Keep going. Yeah, right next to where it says 14%.
um,
You don't see that little four little dots right next to 14%?
sorry, I'm not seeing 14%.
Oh, well, we're seeing 14%.
Oh,
Okay. All right. Let's not worry about it then. Oh, we lost the picture though.
okay. Let's see.
Oh, Peggy asked, how was the initial bridge connected from one side to the other? Was it connected to trees?
No, they built a platform where they essentially have ring holds and then you tie it around the ring, um, which was pretty impressive.
Still
Uh,
strong enough. Hmm.
I don't want to derail the conversation by trying to find all these. The images might be a little bit more cumbersome than I thought. But happy to talk more about the traditions themselves if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. I was interested in the mailman. Um, this just sounds like such an interesting story because he's not just a mailman, he's connected people around the world with a tree.
Yeah, and there's one tree in the world that has its own mailing address, and it is found in the northern part of Germany, deep, deep in a forest. It's called the Bräutigamseiche, which in German means the bridegroom's oak. And for the past 100 years, the German postal system, one of the quickest, most efficient international companies in the world, has been sending a postal carrier to crunch through the woods with letters, to climb a 10-foot tall ladder, and to stuff love letters into the knothole of a tree. And the reason that they do this is because about 120 years ago, two forbidden lovers left notes to each other in that knothole, and they later married under the tree. Ever since, people have started sending love letters to the tree. In kind of in a world before Tinder, just hopeful letters, hoping that somebody might pick up this letter and write them back, and they would find a partner. And this tree is now responsible for more than 100 marriages. And for 20 years, the person who was the faithful caretaker and letter carrier of the tree was a guy named Karl Heinz Martens. He was a grumpy divorcee who had sworn off love when he took this job. And through the course of his service to the tree, he himself found love in the tree. And it's a wonderful story, but what the story is actually really about is about Germans' fascination with the forest, how woodland has shaped the German soul and psyche. Um, and if you, I don't know if there are any Germans watching this, but as someone who lived in Germany for a number of years, any German will tell you that in their core, they're forest people. Um, there's a wonderful German word. The Germans have such beautiful words for melancholy, but one of them is called Verdeinsamkeit, which is called forest. It means forest loneliness. And it's the idea of going to the forest to find yourself and to find something bigger than yourself, which is exactly what this tradition represents. So it's about Germans trusting something in the woods, something that gives them power and truth, and and finding themselves and finding something outside of themselves, perhaps love in the forest.
Mhm. So you said his name was Hans, right?
Karl Heinz Martens.
Carl. So is he happily married and still grumpy?
Get to that in the book, but he and the tree, they share a certain kinship. So um the tree is not in the best health. Um, Carl is not in the best health. They actually have a very similar illness. Um, but I met Carl on two different reporting trips over several different years, and yeah, we get into his wife and how that went. Yeah.
Okay. Cynthia says there are trees in Melbourne that each have their own email address.
Well, there you go.
It's
Perhaps they could be symbolically wed. The bridegroom's up, the one in Melbourne could have a lovely long distance relationship.
maybe. But to me, it seems like from the story of the mirror and the story of the tree, it just seems like people culturally around the world are always trying to see their own truth or find a way to understand themselves and the world around them. And they do it in these amazing ways. Like this question, it seems like these sorts of wonders are only possible in small, insular, homogeneous communities where where they've been together very close for a long time.
I mean, the process of trying to see our own truth, I mean, that's the basis of religion, right?
Mhm.
I think you're exactly right that each of these stories are the sorts of specific things that developed in a type of isolation that no longer exists. And I think that's why you're seeing them fade away. Um, when smartphones connect you across the world and when a budget airline can now kind of whisk you from place to place easier than ever before in history, these sorts of insular, isolated, specific skill type traditions fall by the wayside. Um, and I think I think that's a shame, but I think it's in certain cases inevitable. But whoever made that point is I think is exactly right.
Mhm. Other than the story from Medford, are there any other stories within the US?
Not within the US, no. There's a chapter in Cuba. a chapter in Peru, one in India, one in Taiwan, one in Japan, one in Italy, one in Sweden, one in Germany. Gosh, that might be 10. Um, but yes, it's a pretty one in England. Pretty wide net.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you got to travel and see the world. Um, so what was your favorite story to hear or tell?
They're special to me in different ways. The one about the world's rarest pasta in Sardinia is something that I Sardinia has shaped me by living there in a very special, profound way. So that's near and dear to me. The one about Bala and that takes place in Medford, Mali, and Guinea, um, is very special to me, if only because no one has ever written about this before, and I think it's remarkable. The one in Peru, I think, is probably the single most incredible thing I witnessed as part of reporting this. But others are special to me in different ways. There's one in Sweden that I really, really love. It's about the world's last night watchman. And so for hundreds of years, all through medieval Europe, we had night watchmen. They were when human beings basically first started to congregate in towns, the most dangerous thing were fires. It was just as deadly, if not more deadly, than any disease outbreak. And so we employed these wardens, these guardians, to look out for fire. And it's something very core to who we are as people. And I talk about this in the book, but the very first way that human beings slept um, was to take turns with someone always keeping a lookout for something. So over time, you have modern police departments, modern fire departments, CCTV, smoke detectors. And in a place like Sweden, this once upon a time right no longer makes sense, except in a town called Ystad, where there's been someone walking, climbing 14 stories to the top of a church belfry every night for 500 some years to watch for fires. And for the last 100 years, that person has been part of the same family. And this is a story all about a guy named Roland Borg. Before Roland, there was his father Fritz. Before Fritz, there was his grandfather Helmer. And every night from 9 a.m. to about 2 p.m., I'm sorry, 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., he's 74 years old. He still goes 7 stories up. And he will look out over the town, look for fires, and then push a giant horn through a window and bellow this haunting, beautiful cry, which basically means everything is okay. And the story is really, and so many of these stories are really about one person's sacrifice to a community and service. And I spent 5 bitterly cold nights in late November in Sweden in this unheated, uninsulated hovel up there. And it was incredible. But again, you think about just sort of these cute once upon a time rights, but it became very apparent to me there that, and here's the twist, is that this job that you think is outdated and no longer needed is actually incredibly needed because one of the most infamous criminals in Sweden is a pyromaniac who has set his sights on this town. And he's one of the most wanted criminals in Sweden and has burned down tons of things in Sweden and has set his sights over and over again on this town and has burned things. And this person is known as the Dawn Pyromaniac. He got his name because the night watchman would get off duty and then he would start setting fires. So over the course of my reporting, which was totally random, this person broke out of jail, is now free, and has set his sights one more time on Roland and this town. And so it's a fascinating story through no fault of my own. It's a fascinating story with so much depth about this person who has spent most of his life in this tiny little bell tower, so much so that he feels the world getting warmer. He ushered in a new millennium. He saw the Berlin Wall fall from a tiny black and white TV in there, and he's now sort of been tasked with apprehending or keeping an eye out for this hardened criminal who wants to burn the city down.
Wow. And isn't it amazing to think of every night hearing that sound and knowing that you were safe until the pyromaniac came out, at least.
There's also just to add to that, there's this one lovely thing that I saw. So I was pretty cold in Sweden.
Mhm.
Um, but it's also Sweden, and I would, when walking through the town and these beautiful cobblestone streets, I would look in on these windows at the beautiful Scandinavian design. And then when I would go to meet the night watchman, I would notice that all these windows in the town were cracked open. And I didn't understand this because it was cold and it was freezing. And so I asked everyone, I was, am I crazy or am I seeing that at night you guys open your windows? And they all told me that it's because when they can't hear the night watchman, they don't sleep well. So it's become this thing where people there keep their windows cracked open because his bell cry helps them know that everything is okay. It's almost like being tucked in at night. Um, and there have been calls about automating the bell cry, but I've I've never been anywhere in the world where people crack their windows open in freezing temperatures to hear the recording of a bell. So it's these small things that I think make the world a special place and are worthy of attention.
Absolutely. And as you said, there's a certain sacrifice in that of being, up there every day or, Bala's family being the only person that can play that music and having to memorize the story so that they're the storyteller of that community. Um, Mary Hurley wants to know, did you eat the pasta and was it delicious?
It's incredible. You you make soufflé by pulling semolina dough into 256 perfectly even strips, each about half as wide as angel hair pasta with the tips of your fingers. You then layer it in three different layers over a circular base, have it dry in the Sardinian sun, and then you shatter it, and then you put it into a broth of mutton broth soup with celery, with tons of pecorino. And so when you taste it, because Sardinia also produces most of the pecorino cheese in Italy, so chances are if you buy pecorino cheese somewhere in Massachusetts and it's a real pecorino, chances are it comes from Sardinia. But when you taste it, it's kind of the essence of Sardinia in a bowl. You have pecorino, you have threads of God. It's more of a meal than a soup. It's wonderful.
Mhm. And last question for me is, well, maybe not the absolute last, but did you feel like you had created a community for yourself in meeting all of these different community members that had been doing these things?
Um, a community for myself in the sense of
Meaning, like, would you call up Bala and say, let's go out for a beer? Or would you like, when you next time you're in Sardinia, go and have a piece, the pasta, or like now you can go any of those places and have some people that you can be with.
I became good friends with all these people. I will reiterate, I don't matter. Nobody cares about me. I think the most important thing about the book for me is that I told these folk stories with dignity and honor and accuracy, but this was never about me and you know, I'm just pleased that I think that they're thrilled with how this turned out. And just to reiterate, I mean, so someone like the Night Watchman, Roland, um, the irony of this story is that 47 years ago, the fire brigade from this community closed off the watchtower because they deemed it a fire hazard. So for 47 years, no one has been able to go up into this little belfry with the night watchman. But when he heard that I wanted to interview him, the city made a rare exception. I think Roland understood it was maybe the last chance for him to tell his story and his life's work and his family's work. And so there's a certain power and responsibility for that. And so that's ultimately kind of how I view my role here is to get invisible, let folks tell their own story and to do it with depth.
Mhm. Kathy says it's about sacrifice, but I think it's also about individuals feeling a sense of pride and purpose. And I want to say that it sounds to me like you're being very humble because just like Bala's family, where they have a storyteller and they capture the story so they carry on through history. You've done the same thing in this book. If you've created you've pulled together these stories so that we can learn from you who did all the work so that we can sit back and enjoy and just marvel at like how people are in the world. I mean, like your stories are truly wonderful.
Thank you. And I mean, I hope if readers take one thing away from this, it's that the world can still be a wondrous place. And again, this has nothing to do with me, but I mean, we each wake up every morning and headlines are kind of doom and gloom and things seem very hopeless. But you know, when you think about the latest war or whatever that's going on, you know, somewhere in a German forest, there's a mail carrier crunching through the woods, bringing love letters to strangers, or this magical tiny woman in Sardinia who wakes up at 7 a.m. and slips on an apron and starts making the threads of God. Um, this ultimately is who we are. I mean, take away all the social media stuff and all the technology stuff, but this is kind of who we are, and it's the best of us. And I want people to remember that there's still good in the world. So I hope that's what people take away.
And when you're busy doom scrolling and stuff, it's these stories, these kinds of stories that remind you of the humanity that we all need for ourselves and for our families, I think. So I just so appreciate what you've done and how you've shared it with us tonight. Thank you, Elliot.
And thank you so much for having me, and for all the folks who have many more exciting things to do on a Monday night. I really appreciate you hanging out with me.
They are like the emoji queens and kings here. Really appreciating them. So, yes, we look forward to whatever you do next, Elliot. And for everybody who's been here, thank you for your wonderful questions and your enthusiasm. And I hope you read this book because I actually have it on my desk in the library and I will be reading it along with you all. So, have a wonderful night, Elliot. I hope you have more and more adventures and write about them because I want to hear about them.
Thanks so much for having me, and hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Okay. Good night, everybody.